Brilliant. Thank you very much, Keith, and good afternoon, everybody. My job is to take you on that fascinating journey, as Lord Deben called it, and it really is quite an interesting thing. We're really excited to get to share this with you. I'll take you on that journey for the UK, and then I'll hand over to Tom, and Tom will zoom in on Northern Ireland. And what we're bringing you today is it's the result of about 2 years of work from the really dedicated, talented team at CCC. Huge amount that's gone into this. And we're really building on that work that we did last year, looking at the net zero target. And what we've tried to deliver here, what we tried to bring to the table is a route map, a blueprint for how we go as a rich, developed country from the emissions we've got now down to net zero in 2050. So we'll give you a flavour of the changes on that path. So first of all, just to talk about our approach, so you know how we've got into this. We built a set of scenarios, ways of describing the world, and different pathways from here to zero. And we've started with 3 exploratory scenarios. One of those has a really big role for consumers and behaviour changes. That's the widespread engagement scenario. We also looked at more contribution from technology, the innovation scenario. And we do a headwind scenario where neither of those things help us, and it's quite heavy going. We end up with more reliance on carbon capture. We also bring these together into a scenario that we've called tailwinds, and we were really keen to look at this one. This is what happens if everything goes well. And in that case, we're able to get to net zero a bit earlier than 2050, a bit cheaper, and a really interesting scenario that's laid out in the report. The real value of these, though, is that it's allowed us to construct what we've called a balanced pathway. This is a pathway that has a little bit of everything, moderate assumptions on behavior change, moderate assumptions on innovation, and it keeps in play those various different paths. So it's keeping our options open, it's developing options and exploring what can be done. It's really ambitious, it's really challenging, but it's absolutely feasible. We've been really careful to constrain the speed at which markets can develop, the speed at which supply chains can build up. And we've built all of these pathways on the assumption that we're not scrapping capital stock. We're going at the rate at which the economy replenishes itself, but shifting rapidly towards low carbon. And that balanced pathway is the basis for the recommendations that we've reached. So let's go on to those now. And this is the big one, I guess. This is the key chart in the report that we've published. And you've got here the 6th carbon budget. That's the orange bar on here. And the line, that's the trajectory that we're proposing for emissions from now down to zero. And look at the shape of it. You can see that this is an inverted S shape. It takes us a little while to build those markets, to build those supply chains. And then once we do, we move really quickly through the 2030s, and then we come in and we glide down to 2050. And that means for 2035, we're looking at a 78% reduction in our emissions versus 1990. On the same path, 2030, that's a 68% reduction. That's the NDC that the Prime Minister announced last week. Important to say, this budget we're recommending includes emissions from international aviation shipping, and we've recommended that it is delivered entirely through UK action. This is about doing things in the UK, not paying other countries to do them for us. And I guess the big takeaway here in terms of the level of ambition that's in this is not very long ago, 18 months ago, we were aiming for an 80% reduction in 2050. We've effectively brought that forward to 2035, half the time that we have to deliver it. So anyone that doubts that this is an ambitious budget really hasn't looked at the numbers there. We also think it's a really attractive path, actually. There's lots of things in here which will help us, particularly with the economic recovery and also with improving people's lives. The other advantage of this path that we've got with this relatively front-loaded trajectory is that it keeps down our cumulative emissions. And that's really important for the global picture, which we'll turn to now, and for tackling climate change. So you see here now these curves drawing themselves on the screen. This is what needs to happen for the world as a whole if we're to meet a well below 2-degree objective, that's the red lines, or ideally 1.5, that's the green line. And if we overlay that UK trajectory on it, you can see we have cut our emissions really quite rapidly in the past. And this line that we've proposed, the purple line here, actually gets us down to that 1.5 degree line by 2035. So this is very clearly a Paris-aligned proposal for the UK. So let's go on to how we get there. This, in a way, is the really interesting stuff in the report, the really crunchy stuff about how we actually deliver the changes that we need and what will change in our lives. And this, I think, is a good way of kind of looking at it as a whole. This is our rainbow of abatement, and every stripe here is a different way of reducing the UK's emissions. Taking these from the top, you've got purple ones up here, which are about demand. That's shifting from carbon intensive things like eating meat towards less intensive things like plant-based proteins. And there's some efficiency here as well. So things like insulating your home so you can heat it to be more comfortable using less energy. And these are really important, not just because they give us deep reductions in the near term, look at 2025, 2030, but also because they make the rest of the rainbow easier to deliver. If we go down, then the orange, the red, the yellow here, these are about adopting low carbon technologies. And you can see these are the really important things in the long term. Buying electric cars, installing heat pumps for households, installing carbon capture and storage, using hydrogen in industry. These are the ones that make the real difference in the long term, particularly electrification, that orange one. That's the biggest and brightest stripe on the rainbow because the electrification is the most efficient way of doing things. It's generally the cheapest, so it does the most work. Of course, we need low carbon fuels as well. And the blue wedge here, this is a big expansion of our low carbon electricity. And alongside that, some low carbon hydrogen. And then the green bit at the end, maybe particularly interesting in Northern Ireland. This is the natural offsetting. So this is about taking CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequestering it in trees, sequestering it under the ground by growing biomass, and then using that with carbon capture and storage. And we need that because there will be some things like emissions from cows and sheep and planes that we simply can't offset, that we can't avoid rather, so we have to offset them. And that's why it's net zero rather than simply zero. All of those things taken together, they get us down to net zero in 2050. We've pulled out this slide again because we think this was really popular actually in the net zero work we did, and we've translated it for this work for 2035. And the message here is that this is no longer going to be just a thing that happens on the supply side in big companies behind the meter that people don't notice. This is going to be about people's lives and the things that they do. So the purple here, these are actions like building wind farms. These are things that people don't necessarily notice so much in their day-to-day lives. The orange, these are purely behavioral changes. And you see they make up 16% of the emissions reductions that we need. That's things like eating less meat, maybe flying less, walking, cycling instead of driving. And then the really interesting bit here, the red, these are where you combine a bit of both. There's nothing to be scared of in here. These are very much still living our lives, but doing things a bit differently. So plugging in an electric car at home instead of driving a petrol car and filling it up at the gas station. And the point here really is that we need to bring people with us on this journey. We need to engage them, we need to inform them, and we need to involve them as well. If people feel involved, they're generally much more willing to make the changes that are required. We've really drawn on the findings of the Citizens' Assembly here, the Climate Assembly in the UK. And that showed us that actually people are willing to change if they're properly engaged with and they're given a chance to understand what's needed, particularly if they think it's being done in a fair way and if they're having choices about what they do. So let's move on to the investment numbers and the cost. And this is some of the most exciting new analysis we think in the report. What we've managed to do now is that we've broken out the costs into the investments and into the operational cost saving. And it's a big investment program. We need about an extra £50 billion a year of investment split across the various sectors of emissions. And that buys us something. It buys us net zero in the long term, but it also buys us a big fuel saving. And the fascinating thing here is that actually, once you get past about 2040, that fuel saving is actually bigger than the investment that we need to make each year. So this in the long term has a real opportunity to be positive for the economy. particularly when you think, well, actually, as we come out of the pandemic, we're facing an economy with spare capacity. We've got a need for more investment. We've got a need to stimulate demand. And this program, although designed as a climate program, could very much be an economic program. So a real opportunity here to grow the economy in the short term and the long term by embracing this program. And alongside that, we should say, there's lots of potential boosts and lots of benefits as well. Benefits to health, cleaner air, more green spaces, benefits to biodiversity. So we think we've got quite an attractive picture here when we look at it in the round. We've also, though, crunched the numbers without assuming any of those benefits. And what we've done for this chart is we've annualized those investments across their lifetimes. We've allowed a payback for investors and spread them over their lives. And when you do that, you see that the costs, if anything, will be very small, around or below 1% of GDP. And that compares to a previous expectation of a 1 to 2% cost in 2050. So the cost estimates have come down again. And that reflects that offshore wind in the latest auctions came in much cheaper than we had assumed, even for 2050 in our analysis last year. So we now think we might be looking at maybe 0.5% of GDP as a cost. That's really very small. And we shouldn't be surprised that it's small, because we know that we can produce electricity from renewables just as cheaply, if not cheaper, than we could from gas. We know that electric cars are cheaper to run than conventional cars, and we expect they'll soon be cheaper to buy. So there really is no reason to think we need fossil fuels to access cheap energy anymore. Let's go on then to take you on that journey from now through to 2050. And we start in 2019. Emissions are already down around 41% since 1990, and we've made a little bit of progress in some of the areas that we need to. Crucially, the government has started to put some of the conditions in place. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan is a big step towards demonstrating the right level of ambition. It isn't everything, but it's a really strong platform to build on. And the various strategies that are under development alongside it mean that we are in a position that we can leap off from to get us where we need to be. If we wind forward then to 2025, by this point, this is really about scaling up. The 2020s are a decade of scaling up in this analysis. That means scaling up our offshore wind, scaling up our hydrogen, our heat pump supply, our electric vehicles. We're up to a 50% share of electric vehicles by 2025, building those charge points that they'll need. The first CCS cluster would come online at this point. And then we go through to 2030, and we're really starting to approach a turning point now. This is the 64% is the emissions reduction, including aviation and shipping. That aligns to the 68% reduction when you don't include aviation shipping, as in the NDC. And at this point, you can see actually for electric vehicles, we're almost up to all new vehicles being electric. We've made real progress in the heat sector. We're installing over 1 million heat pumps every year. We've got 5 CCS clusters now up and running. We've got 40 gigawatts of offshore wind. The transition is really strongly underway. And we fast forward to 2035, the middle of the 6th carbon budget period. And the amazing thing is that actually at this point, most of the parts of the economy are at the run rate that they need to be at in order to get through to 2050. All of our new cars, all of our replacement boilers are low carbon ones. We've got a big scale up in zero carbon power, which is now supplying the entire sector. There's no unabated gas being used anymore by 2035. All homes have been well insulated. All of our steel making is now zero carbon. We're using CCS on energy from waste as well as other applications. We've reduced our consumption of meat by quite a bit. We might have moved perhaps to some lab-grown meat by this point. We've got a really high rate of tree planting. Our peatland restoration is up to really high levels. And then from here, we simply roll those things through the stock and glide in to 2050, at which point the power sector is considerably larger. We've got a big supply of low carbon hydrogen. We've restored almost, but not quite all of our peatland. We're still planting trees at a rapid rate, and people's diets have now shifted to around 1/3 moved away from meat. And that taken together gets us down to net zero. We think it's quite an attractive world. It's not hugely different in terms of people's lives, but it's hugely different in terms of the energy system, in terms of the way we use our land, and in terms of some of the choices that we're making. And if we go on, then the last slide for me before I hand over to Tom is just to say, this isn't clearly a technical challenge anymore. We know how to do this. It's not really an economic challenge. We know that this is entirely affordable. That isn't one of the objections to action here. The real challenge actually is to get the policy right, to actually deliver these changes on the ground. And I'm not going to run through these, but this is just a flavor of all the policies that are under development at the moment. And all of these need to be developed, and all of them need to have a very, very high level of ambition, a real focus on delivery and getting on with it now. There is an awful lot that needs to be done. And all of this needs to be coordinated. They need to coordinate with each other between sectors, and they need to coordinate vertically between the UK government, the Northern Irish government, local governments as well, and with businesses and with people. If we do all of this, then the UK will be setting a really, really strong example to bring to COP26 next year. And we can come to that confidently with a positive vision and a strong package to deliver the changes that we need. Okay, I'll hand over to Tom at that point to take us through the Northern Ireland specific material. Tom.
Thanks very much, Mike, for walking us through those. So I'm about to show you some slides in a second that kind of take our UK pathways and distill them for Northern Ireland. And I think it's fair to say that these slides are not as polished as the really beautiful ones that we got our design agency to do for the UK launch. But the quality of the analysis that's gone into it, I think, is exactly the same. I think it's fair to say that this is by far the best position that the CCC has been in for a number of years in terms of being able to dig down into our UK pathways and actually bring up what those numbers mean for Northern Ireland and indeed for Scotland and Wales as well. So if we go to the first slide, Mike. So this kind of slide shows you effectively the effort that Northern Ireland is expected to contribute to UK net zero and on the path to CB6. Now, Northern Ireland currently is responsible for around about 5% of UK emissions. So that's that kind of green bar that you see at the top there. And over the period of the transition for the UK, we see Northern Ireland paying its fair share of that emissions reduction. So we won't have time to go into it today, but if you zoom into the specific sectoral detail in a lot of these things that's available on our website and in our various reports that we're producing today, you'll see that the pathway for each individual sector for Northern Ireland looks very, very similar in general to what's happening at the UK level on the whole. So that is a wholesale transition of the energy system. It's people using low carbon heating in their homes. It's people choosing to walk and cycle more and drive electric vehicles. All of those things are happening at the same time. And we end up in a position where Northern Ireland ends up within the scenarios that we've developed for UK to reach net zero in 2050 in a slightly different place to the UK as a whole. So we can show that on the next slide. So in this chart, emissions fall by 54% compared to current levels in 2035 as part of the contribution to the UK analysis. And effectively what we see is very deep emissions reductions in all of these scenarios. So going from a position where emissions in Northern Ireland are roughly 25 million tonnes of carbon every year to below 5 million tonnes of carbon by 2050. That equates, as we'll show you in a little bit, to at least an 82% reduction on emissions compared to 1990 levels, which is the baseline that we use to compare emissions reductions to. But what we see here is that the scenarios don't reach net zero in 2050 at the same time as the UK, even though the actions that you're doing within these scenarios are equally as stretching. And I think the next slide will kind of demonstrate what's happening there. So if you kind of compare this to the chart that we showed you for the UK, what's happening in the bottom left of this screen is those purple, red and yellow bars are what you might call the energy system in Northern Ireland. So that's it's transport and it's heating buildings and it's supplying electricity. And what we see there is very similar to what's happening to the UK as a whole. So you're moving to a virtually zero emissions energy system well before the time that you get to 2050. At the same time, the three bars that you see at the top, which is manufacturing and construction and the supply of fossil fuels, of which there is very little in Northern Ireland, but a significant manufacturing sector. And also things like waste and some specific different types of gases that we call F gases. They also reduce to very low levels over time. And what you're left with really is these green bars in 2050. And those are Northern Ireland's emissions from agriculture and the emissions that are associated with land. And then on the next slide, we then kind of look in a bit more detail at that snapshot in 2050. And that also allows us to compare it to the advice that we gave to Northern Ireland in 2019. So on the far left, this bar is what we call our balanced net zero pathway for the UK, translated into Northern Ireland level. Now, what you see there is that agriculture emissions at this point are really dominant in terms of the residual emissions that are left in the economy. And the dark green, which is the land use sink, so it's the amount of carbon that's removed from the atmosphere due to mainly forestry, is not big enough, we think, in Northern Ireland to offset those emissions. However, we do think that's changed marginally since the advice that we gave in 2019. So what we've done this year is we've actually explored a range of different options for each sector. I think we've demonstrated that there can be scope to further reduce emissions from land by being more ambitious on things like tree planting and, crucially in Northern Ireland, peatland restoration, which could add up to around about 10 percentage points onto the current estimate of emissions once those are included fully within the Northern Ireland greenhouse gas inventory within the next 5 years or so. So we've identified that those things can go further, we think, depending on the assumptions that you make. And we've also shown where we can further reduce emissions from certain sectors as well. So there is space to go further within agriculture, but we don't necessarily want all of our assumptions to take that for granted, because the stuff that we're assuming in our balanced pathway is already very challenging and does require a substantial change in the way that our land is used. And we also see further options to reduce emissions a little bit more from sectors like waste and aviation as well in particular. So going on to the next slides. So then this kind of raises a question that's already been mentioned in the Q&A, and I'll try and cover that a little bit in the presentation, and then hopefully discuss it in a little bit more detail as part of the Q&A. So once we've built that pathway for emissions in sectors that already exist in Northern Ireland, we then have to think about, well, what about this new sector, which we call greenhouse gas removals technologies? So this is largely BECCS is what we call it. So it's the combustion of biomass. And when you combust that biomass, you apply carbon capture and storage. And that gives you effectively a negative removal, because you're gaining all of the carbon that's been removed from the atmosphere whilst that bioresource has grown. And then when you combust it for power, you capture the carbon and you can bury it underground. You can do that safely. You can do it, we think, cost effectively. But that effectively gives you negative removals that can offset your residual emissions. So the question for Northern Ireland really then becomes, well, if the agricultural sector is going to take significant action, as we've set out in these scenarios, but if there is going to be still a substantial amount of residual emissions by 2050, how much additional kind of amounts of greenhouse gas removals technology would you need in order to get to net zero? And in our balanced pathway for Northern Ireland, we think that's around about 5 megatons of removals, which equates to more or less 10% of the UK total. Now, that's quite a lot, and we think it's probably more than the Northern Ireland's, what we would say is a fair share on one hand of what Northern Ireland should be doing for the UK's greenhouse gas removals. It requires a significant amount of bioresource that would conceivably have to be shipped over from Great Britain to Northern Ireland in order to be combusted with CCS in Northern Ireland, which doesn't necessarily make sense. And it's also a really significant portion compared to a number of things in Northern Ireland. So compared to current emissions, compared to population, compared to size of the economy, compared to land area, things like that as well. We do think that there is a role for greenhouse gas removals technology in Northern Ireland. There definitely is a future for it. We think it's something that should be looked into and encouraged. But we can't say with confidence that the pathways that we've developed would allow Northern Ireland to get to net zero with the use of greenhouse gas removals technologies at the same time as the UK. So moving on to the next slide, please, Mike. So with that in mind, we've then responded in a letter which sets out this stuff in a little bit more detail to the Minister, Edwin Poots, who basically asked us what our assessment is of a fair contribution to the UK net zero goal in 2030 and in 2050. The first thing I think to say that comes out of that letter that we've written today is that because all greenhouse gases contribute to warming temperatures, all greenhouse gases need to be reduced in Northern Ireland as part of the contribution to UK net zero. And we're therefore recommending that any set of climate targets for Northern Ireland should include a target to reduce all greenhouse gas emissions by at least 82% by 2050 to be in line with the UK net zero goal. Now, that doesn't mean it's the only target that Northern Ireland could set, and we're certainly very open to continuing to have a discussion with the Northern Ireland executive on the precise kind of mechanism and definition of a target and the appropriate levels of those targets over time. And some of the things that we've explored are in the next slide. So the first one is to recognise that of the long-lived greenhouse gases, so things that sit in the atmosphere for a long time, carbon dioxide is the one that contributes the most to global warming, and therefore the date of when you can reduce your CO2 emissions to net zero is largely it's the one that's most important for when global temperature rises end. Now, the pathway that we've developed for Northern Ireland gets to net zero CO2 emissions before 2050 as part of the contribution to UK net zero. So one of the possible additions or supplementary targets, as we call them in the letter, to a target for all greenhouse gases could be a commitment to setting a net zero target for CO2 only. However, and this is something that we've repeatedly stressed, that cannot be the only target. So methane emissions do need to have, they do contribute to global warming. They are leading to rising temperatures across the globe, and therefore you can't give methane a free pass by excluding it from any targets. And then the final thing that we've been asked to look at again is in relation to something that's happening in the Republic of Ireland. So they're considering setting a target for all greenhouse gases, excluding biogenic methane. And this is something that's happening elsewhere in the world as well. New Zealand have got a similar mechanism in their climate targets. And again, the message is loud and clear that there needs to be a target for all greenhouse gases if it's to be an appropriate contribution to the UK net zero goal. However, if you choose to set a target on the basis of basically making sure that all other greenhouse gases get to very, very low levels, and you continue to treat the methane emissions that come from agriculture and come from livestock, then you will get to much deeper levels of emissions reduction, purely looking on a percentage basis under the pathways that we've drawn out. I think that is that from that slide, Mike. So moving on to the, before I move on to talk about this, actually, this is an analysis of the costs of taking action in Northern Ireland. One final thing I think I'd say on the this kind of specific targets that we're talking about for Northern Ireland. A big part of the story, as we've seen, is that agriculture emissions are still there in Northern Ireland and can't be offset, we think, by the land resources that Northern Ireland has in 2050. Now, I think there's an additional point to be made, is that is entirely appropriate and fair as part of a contribution to UK net zero. I'm sure most people on this call, in the audience and everything else, will be aware that Northern Ireland is a significant exporter of agri-food products, particularly to the rest of the UK. And therefore, we think it's only right and only fair that some of the emissions that are associated with agricultural activity in Northern Ireland are offset elsewhere in the UK. It could be forestry in Scotland, it could be energy crops grown in England, it could be peatland that's restored in Wales. So it's all part of the kind of what we're calling a fair and equitable contribution to net zero for the whole of the UK. And then final two slides that I'd like to walk you through is basically, this is a translation of what we showed you earlier for the UK, and this is that capex and opex split for Northern Ireland. So the first thing to show is that low carbon capital investment will need to scale up pretty significantly to we think somewhere between £2 and £2.5 billion per year in 2030 as part of the contribution to the UK. But then that also brings with it very significant savings as well. So exactly the same as the capex and opex story previously. Doing that investment now buys you net zero. It buys you additional savings in things like fuel costs and efficiency improvements. And then the third thing is that we think that also buys you very significant kind of macroeconomic impacts as well. At that point, I think I'll probably wrap up and hand back to Mike to kick off the Q&A.